Past 5 years or so, the Commission has conducted several inquiries into significant issues impacting children and young people in care. Each of these inquiries has touched on the educational experiences of children and young people in care and has helped to highlight that although many children feel that school is a safe and enjoyable experience, to many children and young people in care, they're experiencing educational disadvantage and disconnection from school. And it is having a severe impact on their ability to benefit from learning in the same way that other young people do. The CCYP's recent inquiry has been a remarkable piece of work, putting education at the forefront and calling out what many in our sector have been saying for some time, that children and young people in care need more support, including tailored re-engagement programs and coordinated responses from the services and systems that are responsible for their learning, care and wellbeing. We know that poor educational experiences have significant impacts on children's overall wellbeing and further increases their risk of social isolation. And over the long term, poor educational experiences places young people at a disadvantage in terms of their ability to engage in post-secondary study and enjoying a fulfilling career in the same way their peers do. That is why it's so important that we host discussions like we are today, to not only learn more about the data and the experiences of young people, but also to spark conversations about what needs to occur to change the story so we can better work together and generate momentum that will lead to lasting change for children and young people. So a really exciting session today. We are videoing this and recording this, so for those that can't get here, you'll be able to watch it at your leisure. But before I share a few more details about today, I would firstly like to open this session with an acknowledgement of country. Today we gather online across Victoria on various Aboriginal lands to hear about the educational experiences of children and young people in care. And it is critical that we acknowledge the experiences of Aboriginal children in this discussion who we know face additional barriers to their engagement and learning and education. Today, we will have an opportunity to walk away with a deeper understanding of these experiences and hopefully some ideas of how these can be better addressed as a community so that First Nations children feel safe, supported and connected to learning. I'm joining today from Wurundjeri country and I acknowledge elders past and present as well as our First Nations colleagues who are with us today in this session. The Centre acknowledges that sovereignty was never ceded, and this always was and will always be Aboriginal land. Okay, so now to a bit of an event overview, and this is on your screen. But before I do introduce our guest today, I will briefly run through the session outline. We are lucky to hear from both commissioners today. It's always a pleasure to be in any room, let alone a virtual room, with our two commissioners, who will be joined by two impressive young people who've been critical to shaping the inquiry and report findings. And they will all speak for about an hour, in which I hope you will note down any questions you may have for them about the report findings, as we will have time for a Q&A session after the presentation, which will be facilitated by Pearl Goodwin-Burns, our Raising Expectations Program Manager. I want to say, the more I read this report, the more I learn from it, the more that's in it. So today is just another one of those conversations that we are having to make sure that we own the findings and try and get them fully implemented. Finally, a quick run through who you can contact if you do have any tech issues. Lani is here today to help with any issues you may be experiencing. You can use the chat function to ask Lani any questions you may have, but I do find that leaving and rejoining the session often helps. We've all become able to do that sort of tech solution, but sometimes it's even beyond me, and Lani can help you. Now to introduce our first speaker, I'd like to introduce Commissioner Buchanan and Commissioner Singh and the young people. So I'll just quickly go through them. They're all beautifully up on the screen for you. So Liana Buchanan has been Victoria's Principal Commissioner for Children and Young People since 2016 and is also a part-time Commissioner of the Victorian Law Reform Commission. Liana has background in oversight and system reform for people experiencing disadvantage and those affected by family and sexual violence. As Principal Commissioner, she is responsible for promoting children's rights, regulating organisations that work with children to prevent child abuse, and monitoring services for children and young people, including those in out-of-home care, child protection and our youth justice systems. Meena Singh is the Commissioner for Aboriginal Children and Young People in Victoria. She is a Yorta Yorta, an Indian woman, born and living on the land of the Kulin Nation. Meena started her legal career with Victorian Legal Aid, where she practiced in human rights and criminal law, and was also their inaugural Associate Director, Aboriginal Services. She has led legal services and programs at the Victorian Aboriginal Legal Service and the Human Rights Law Centre, as well as consulting in training and organisational development across many organisations. She has a passion for centering the voices of people with lived experience and service design that promotes inclusion, connection, and ultimately achieves social justice and equitable outcomes. So, Nikita Martin-Koo has been involved with the Commission for Children and Young People's work since 2017, sharing her lived experience for various systematic inquiries. She joined the Commission's Youth Council around 18 months ago, and alongside her peers was integral in shaping the recommendations for the Let Us Learn report. And finally, Missy Joyce just connected with the Commissioner for Children and Young People when she started her experiences as part of the consultations for Let Us Learn. Missy has had an immediate impact, and soon after she joined the Youth Council alongside her peers, she's been advocating for the changes needed in Victoria's education and care systems. So all amazing women here on this panel today. Both Nikita and Missy both have been immersing themselves across different aspects of the Commission's advocacy work, and I think you will, along with me, see how incredible they are today. So I'm pleased to welcome all four of you to join us today and look forward to hearing from you now. Now over to all of you for the next part of the session, but please put your comments and questions in the chat because I'm sure my colleagues will be able to respond to those as we go. So welcome to all four of you.
Thanks so much, Deb. Checking I'm not on mute. And thanks indeed to the Centre for Excellence in Child and Family Welfare for working with us to set up this webinar and help us keep getting the messages and the information from this inquiry out there. I too would like to start by acknowledging traditional owners on the lands on which we're each sitting or standing today. I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and pay my deep respects to elders past and present and to all First Nations colleagues who are joining with us today, including, of course, Meena as Commissioner for Aboriginal Children and Young People. We've got a number of slides that we'll run through. This is a pretty kind of data-rich inquiry, and by data I mean the numbers that we've crunched, but as importantly, if not more importantly, the qualitative information that we heard from children and young people and many, many other stakeholders. So Meena and I will run through the slides and Missy and Kita at different times will kind of step in and share some of their perspectives and their reflections. Meena, I think you're going to do the amazing screen sharing. Ta-da! Thank you. Most of you, I hope, will know a little bit about the Commission for Children and Young People. I won't go into any great detail, other than to say one of our functions is to provide monitoring and oversight of the out-of-home care and child protection systems. And we do that in a whole range of ways ongoing. But our powers include the power to initiate systemic inquiries, so bigger inquiries that look at the way systems or aspects of systems impact groups of children and young people. As Deb said, we've done a number of systemic inquiries. In fact, when I counted up, starting with one in 2015, when Bernie Geary was the Principal Commissioner, we've now tabled 10 systemic inquiries looking at different aspects of the child protection and out-of-home care systems, as well as a couple on youth justice. And so they all do look at different aspects, but some of our really significant pieces of work, and I kind of think particularly about the inquiry that we tabled at the end of 2019 called In Our Own Words. And we really sought in that piece of work to look at children and young people's experience of the care system in a very holistic way. And I remember when we were doing the consultations and engagement for that inquiry, and we were hearing again and again from children and young people about school and issues they were having at school and how they found school. And I remember we were starting to try and write up a chapter in that big inquiry on education. And I remember us kind of coming together with some of the young people we were working with at the time and realizing that we actually couldn't begin to do justice to these issues in one little chapter. So we recognized that we wanted to look at the issues around the education system and the out-of-home care system and how these two systems work together or don't to support the educational engagement of children and young people in care. And that's where we got to with Let Us Learn. You might move on to the next slide, Meena. The terms of reference are pretty clear. What kind of experiences do children and young people in care have through their education? What are some of the barriers to education? We were looking at a time frame that included remote learning and the pandemic, so we wanted to have a bit of a look at that. We know that we heard a lot from children and young people, including those in care, about how they found that period of time. We wanted to explore how effective the different departmental policies and practices are. And of course, because that's why we do the work we do at the Commission, we wanted to make some recommendations for change that was needed. Next slide, please. When we do our work at the Commission, as I alluded to before, the primary evidence that we go about collecting is to hear from children and young people with lived experience. This was no different. So as well as what we'd heard prior to Let Us Learn, we spoke directly with over 100 children and young people who either were in care when we spoke to them or who had recent care experience. Another 88 children and young people responded to an online survey that we had. And in addition, we went really right around the state, also talking to different stakeholders, different people working in schools, working in child protection, working in care agencies, a huge range of different workers and professionals. We received submissions from some individuals and organisations, and of course, because we have particular powers to require departments to share information and data with us when we initiate one of these inquiries, we use those powers to get and then analyse some of the quantitative data on different aspects of the system that hadn't previously been public or visible. Next slide, please. In a nutshell, we heard from children and young people that they want to do well at school. They want to enjoy school. They want to thrive at school. School really matters. For some children and young people, school was the place that they felt safe, as the third quote in this slide suggests. And for others, it was where they could feel some of the time like a normal, so-called normal kid, or at least a kid who hadn't been through some of the tough stuff that they'd been through. Next slide, Meena. Unfortunately, though, whilst some of the children and young people we spoke to had some good experiences at school, we heard a lot about negative school experiences. This slide picks up on a few of those. Bullying from peers, not having a sense that teachers understand and can kind of give education in a way that the young person or the child is kind of ready for. And then the kind of third quote there talks about that experience of starting to disengage from school, and a sense that no one, including carers or the department, no one's really paying much attention to whether they're at school or not, and to whether that's an important thing for them to do. Next slide, please. And the next one, maybe. So some of what I'm going to share now is some of the quantitative data in terms of, what as a state we look at when we're trying to understand whether children and young people are engaged with school, doing well at school. We looked at what some of the measures are. Now, we didn't particularly set out to critique the measures that are currently used. You'll see in here there's a reference to NAPLAN. We know NAPLAN is not the be all and end all of student achievement. We're very clear about that. But we certainly worked with the department to understand, well, what are the different pieces of data that you currently collect that give us an indication about how students in care and other students are faring in terms of their engagement and achievement. We did look at early childhood education in this inquiry, which was a bit of a first. There's not as much content on it in a lot of the discussion in the report, but we looked at some aspects. And really the story that you can see from this data is a positive story, because the improvement in children in care being enrolled in 3-year-old kinder and 4-year-old kinder has been marked in recent years, really significant. That 3-year-old kinder improvement from 34% of children in care being enrolled in 2018 to 72%, really significant. 89% of Aboriginal children in care who were eligible for 4-year-old kinder were enrolled. So really good enrolment data. One of the things we call out in the report is that there's not actually good engagement data or even attendance data for early childhood education. So there's a once-a-year census, but other than that, the only way of trying to get a proxy for attendance or engagement is enrolment. So we've made some recommendations, as you might imagine, about that. When it came to school students in care, here's some of the measures that we worked out. 64% of secondary school students in care and almost half of primary school students in care were chronically absent, so absent more than 10% of the school year. This next piece of data was probably one that shocked me, even though I was expecting some pretty significant discrepancies. Only a quarter of students in care make it to year 12, compared to 82% of the overall student population. That is a massive, massive difference. When we did look at NAPLAN, we saw that students in care were much more likely not to participate in NAPLAN. Lots of them were given or offered exemptions, some which might have been very well-intentioned and for really good reasons. Some we had to question whether they were needed or not. Students in care were 25 percentage points less likely to participate in NAPLAN than the broader student population. And across every domain of NAPLAN, students in care who did participate recorded lower achievement scores, attainment scores. Students in care in COVID had a higher absence rate than other students. And what the data shows is that even since schools returned to on-site learning, the bounce back in terms of returning to school, returning to prior attendance rates, that bounce back has not been as prompt or as good for students in care as it has been for the broader student population. Moving to the next slide. When we looked at some of the data around exclusionary and restrictive practices, again, we saw pretty horrendous discrepancies. We had a lot when we were talking to different stakeholders, children and young people and carers and other people working for them. We had a lot about modified timetables. So this idea that a student in care, potentially any student, is given a modified timetable. They only have to come to school an hour a day or a couple of hours, 3 days a week. And we had a lot about the fact that that might sometimes be helpful or necessary for a period of time, but there was no regulation about it, no real monitoring of it, and no clear guidance about what the schools had to do to try and then support that student to return full time. We also heard that students in care, or learnt that students in care were 5 times more likely to be suspended than the general population, 5 times more likely to be expelled than the general population, 7 times more likely to be the subject of incidents of restraint or seclusion. If I go back to that suspension data, people might think that's predominantly students in secondary school. When we looked at it, we were seeing children in prep and in grade 1 being suspended. So children in care in prep are 12 times more likely to be suspended than other preppies. So we're not talking about older students exclusively. We also heard a bit about the practice of informal suspensions or soft expulsions, communications to students that are outside of the regulated approach to suspensions and expulsions, but that very clearly send the message to students and carers that they're no longer welcome in different ways. These aren't authorised, so as a result, they're not regulated, and as a result, they're not captured, but we had a huge amount of that from stakeholders. Keita or Missy, I might pause there. Is there anything that you wanted to add in, either about the findings as we kind of work through this, because you were part of this inquiry with us, or some of the perspectives you bring on these? Missy.
I did just want to say about the modified timetables. When Liana, you say that they're 5 times more likely to be suspended, like kids in care, it's absolutely true. Like, it's absolutely like, it's not something that gets avoided. Like, I feel like for teachers and for people in stressful situations for kids in care, the initial reaction is just to like shut it down, push it away, rather than deal with it. And I think that's quite a big problem. Yeah.
I have something to say about the modified timetables and also the statistics around suspensions and soft expulsions. I was on a modified timetable, and it was helpful in a sense at the time because I had a very long travel time to get to school from my placement at the time. It was roughly around 3 hours to school and 3 hours home. So I would leave the train station at 6 a.m. and then get back to the train station later that day at 6 p.m. And I would still need to be on a modified timetable to go to school. And it kind of wasn't, they're not regulated. Like, the periods that I missed, even though me and my principal had agreed on it, it still came up through the system as me being absent. So it didn't really reflect that well on my record. And I definitely did get suspended quite a few times in primary school and throughout high school. And the only thing that really comes to mind when I think about that is I was really, really lucky to be happy and feel safe in my placement while I was in care. But to be externally suspended as a child in care doesn't really make sense to me, because usually your carers don't always have like all the time in the world to look after you. And especially if you're living in residential care, it makes even less sense to be made to stay home when you've expressed not great behavior.
Thanks, Missy. Thanks, Keita. We might go to the next slide. And Keita, you just mentioned Resi. Again, we're still on just the kind of pure quantitative data, primarily from the Department of Education. Some of the slides that Meena will talk to on residential care and kind of broader experiences go to why some of these outcomes are as they are. But certainly across all domains, outcomes for children and young people in residential care were substantially worse, whether it comes to chronic absence data, as you'll see on the slide, in terms of the numbers of children and young people in year 12 who are enrolled in year 12 whilst they're in residential care, and also in terms of the NAPLAN results. There was a quote from someone, from a stakeholder working in the care system. It's not on this slide, that kind of says effectively, you couldn't design a system less well placed to support young people to stay engaged with education, and certainly some of what we heard reflected that. These are a couple of quotes from young people we spoke to. There was certainly a theme around young people feeling that amongst the people, the adults around them, education was not seen as a priority. And so in terms of placement decisions, in terms of kind of focus that carers, workers in residential care and others might bring, education was not seen. They didn't get a sense that it was something that was important. So as I say, we've kind of got quite a lot of information about some of the things that might improve for children and young people in residential care. We might go to the next slide now. And again, I'm on all the numbers data bits. We looked at the care system and of course heard a lot. And I should say this inquiry, more than any other we've done, was an inquiry where different stakeholders would point the finger at the system that they weren't involved in. So when we spoke to people in child protection, people in out-of-home care services, carers, but predominantly people working in that system, they were very clear to point criticism to schools. Schools won't enrol our kids, they don't support our kids properly, and so on. When we spoke to a lot of the education stakeholders, they were quick to point to all the aspects of the care system that made it really difficult for the students that they saw to stay actively and well engaged with school. So it was very much a sense of systems pointing the finger at each other rather than kind of working together and wrapping around these young people. We might go to the next slide, Meena. We were very clear that, of course, there's aspects of school that might need to change to do better for children and young people in care, but also there are some things about the care system that make staying in school difficult. We looked at some of the data that we'd looked at 4 years prior when we did the In Our Own Words inquiry to see whether some of the things that impacted children and young people's experience of the care system were getting better or getting worse. Overall, we know the system, the number of children in young people in the care system has increased. It increased from by 13% from December 2018 to December 2022. Really significant increase, 21% for Aboriginal children in care. That's still going in absolutely the wrong direction. We heard a lot in past inquiries and again in this one about how tough it can be if you're a young person in care and you don't have a known allocated worker to make contact with, to check in with, to raise issues with if things aren't going well. The proportion of children in care who are case managed by child protection and who don't have an allocated worker, that had increased by the time we were looking at this inquiry to almost 1 in 5 young people not having an allocated worker. There'd been a growth in the number of child protection workers. We know that there's been massive and important investment by the Victorian government over the years, but we know that vacancy rates are still high. It's pretty hard to retain and attract child protection staff. And so at the time frame we were looking at, there were still 230 odd vacancies in child protection. We know that children and young people are impacted when there's worker turnover. So either not having an allocated worker or they have multiple workers. They don't even get to know the workers they have. And practitioner attrition rates had also worsened since we last looked at this in 2018, 2019. Placement instability, a pretty clear key driver of educational disengagement. It's pretty hard to stay engaged at school. We've just heard Keita describe massive travel time, but if you're being moved from placement to placement, regardless of the amount of disruption to your whole life, changes in school that might be driven by that also clearly affect your ability to learn. And placement instability, unfortunately, had increased, had got worse across all care types. We had a lot about carers and what carers need by way of financial support and other support. Kinship care, of course, we all know, is by far the largest care type. We had a lot about financial impacts on carers, and the fact that lack of access to care allowance, to finance, had a direct impact on children's ability to go to school and to go to school with the things they needed. Victoria's care allowance hasn't increased since 2016, and we are still amongst the lowest in Australia. And as I said, we heard a lot, both from young people themselves and from carers, about what that meant in terms of young people not being well supported to go to school. I might pause again and see between Kita and Missy whether there's anything that you want to add.
I just wanted to say that, yeah, the support for carers isn't really up to scratch. And I know that I was very, very fortunate to have carers who were able to pay for my Myki. And my Myki was very expensive, considering I took one V line, 2 metro trains, and a bus just to get to school. And the offer of like transportation wasn't kind of on the table due to me having to travel such a far distance, and that was kind of a choice that I made myself, because I didn't want to change school again, because I think I was up to my 10th school in year 9, so I was personally okay with traveling like 6 hours to go to school. But it definitely would help if there were alternatives, or like, you know, little resources or loopholes that practitioners or workers had in their like little practice folio, because things like that kind of help, especially because, you know, my Myki was about $20 per week, and I also used to get an allowance, but then when I started traveling that far, that was my allowance. So I think that it should probably be looked into more. But if you have a young person in your if you have a young person, there's actually a thing called the Access Travel Pass, and it basically is like a free Myki for your entire life, and you don't need to touch on or touch off. And I'm pretty sure you can apply to get one if you have a disability or anything that needs to be accommodated. Like personally for me, I have ADHD and I have a brain injury, so I just say that I don't remember to touch on and touch off, which is very true. And basically, I can never get fined. So yeah.
Thanks, Kita. Missy, did you want to add anything?
I was pretty much just gonna agree with what Kita had to say, that the support for carers is like, it's not necessarily that it's limited. Well, it is, but they also don't know about it as well. Like when I was in kinship care for a long time, my auntie, sometimes I just think like, how did she do it? Like there was a period of time at the very start where we were living out of town, and she had her kids in like different schools, and then we were in a different school, and she'd have to drive all the way there and drop us off and drive back and pick us up. And like fuel these days is, everything's expensive. Like everything costs money. Like everything is just like ridiculous. Like you go to Coles and you spend $100 on one bag of things. Like it's ridiculous. But sometimes I just wonder like what would have happened if there was extra support, like maybe fuel vouchers or more bus systems or something like that, or like bus passes, like how it would have worked, how it could have made it better. And also it's not necessarily again that it wasn't there, just also because workers and stuff, like they didn't tell her, like she didn't know. So it was all very new for everyone. Like when you wake up one morning and there's workers at your door saying, you need to have these kids, you need to look after these kids. And she's like, well, what the heck am I meant to do? Yeah, it just makes it really difficult. Yeah.
Thanks, Missy. I won't take over some of what Meena and the two of you might cover a bit later. We've certainly in this inquiry made recommendations, including around free public transport travel for students, for children in care generally. We heard so much about the challenges of just getting to school and the extra financial impost that put on families, carers already doing it really tough. It seems like a bit of a no-brainer to us. We might move to the next slide, and this is the last slide before I hand over to Meena. And these really are just a very few of the many quotes and accounts and stories that we heard from people about the ways in which those pressures in the care system impacted children and young people and their ability to stay in school. Workforce pressures, again, this sense the workers always changing. I can't get to know them or even trust them. I've had 3, 4, maybe 5 workers over 18 months. They're meant to come every month, but they haven't. I don't like them. They're not humans. I wish they actually tried to build a relationship and get the kids to trust them. 12-year-old child shared that with us. Placement instability, moving around from house to house and being in an unstable condition increased my anxiety, made it hard to meet new people and go to new places like I have to do at school. Kalani, 13, who'd been in multiple different kinds of placement, shared that. You've both just heard from, you've heard from both Keita and Missy, a reflection that we heard a lot, which is from children and young people. They are so conscious of what's going on for their carers, how things are tough for their carers, as well as the way that impacts on them. And we heard that again and again from different children. I won't read out all of the quotes. And then certainly in terms of the really high and worsening proportion of Aboriginal children in the care system, we heard from children and young people describing the direct impact that has, that disconnection has, on their self and their sense of identity and their cultural safety, and what that means for them when they go into school. So sadly, whilst there's lots of people doing a lot of work in the government, it's trying to improve investment in the care system, it's slow, and some of these measures that directly impact children and young people, including their engagement with school, are going sadly still in the wrong direction. Over to you, Meena.
Thanks, Liana. Just before I delve into things, I'm just also going to take a moment to, as part of my own cultural protocols as the Yorta woman, pay my respects to the traditional owners of the lands that I'm on and everyone who's calling in or joining us from. Like Liana, I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. Acknowledge wherever we are land over which sovereignty was never ceded. So the slides, the aspects I'm going to talk through with Keita and Missy's help is, I think, 2 key things sums up about what I'll go into, and that's about the importance of relationships and understanding, and having relationships between key people in a child or a young person's life, understanding what's going on for that child or young person. And I think what we heard a lot of is that just desperate need from children and young people to have people understand what it is that they experience when they're in out-of-home care. And for me, this inquiry started just before I started my role as Commissioner for Aboriginal Children and Young People, and I was lucky to go around regionally and speak directly with particularly Aboriginal children and young people. And it was a sense of being very much just heard and understood, and then having people build relationships from that understanding, and really placing the child and young person at the centre of those relationships. So I'm going to go into the experiences at school that children and young people in care had. And I think this quote really tells a lot. The way teachers communicate with us, they don't understand. It's difficult for us to get to school when we are being moved about, all the things we've heard already. Those who have mental health issues and have missed chunks of school don't feel motivated by those around me to attend. Don't take it out on the kids. It's hard for us. Be understanding of our situations, I think, is so vitally important. So to look at the challenges to educational engagement, and this inquiry focused obviously on children in out-of-home care, but what we learned is that so many of these things apply to children and young people who aren't in out-of-home care, who might be experiencing other forms of whatever in their life that are making engagement difficult. But for us, we really saw how it played out significantly for children in out-of-home care. So what we saw was inappropriate responses to trauma-related behaviours. This is something that just came through so clearly about understanding what it is that a child or young person in out-of-home care has been through in their life, potentially has been through the night before or the morning of arriving at school, and what emotions they were having to navigate and having to basically switch off to engage in schools as the majority of schools are set up. And this quote, our brains are wired different because of what we have been through and how the trauma has impacted us. We need more support and encouragement and less rigid regulation. So again, that understanding is so important. Lack of understanding in schools about the out-of-home care system in and of itself. So just not understanding what it means to be a kid in out-of-home care and how a child could come into contact with the system and what impact that system had. Really sadly, we heard about negative attitudes, bullying and low expectations of student in care. And sadly, we heard about negative attitudes and bullying, not just from peers at school, but also from teachers who, I think the quote just is astounding. A few of the teachers haven't been good. They make insulting comments about my personal life, about living in out-of-home care. At some point last year, we shared in class what we did on our weekends. I spoke about having ice cream, and the teacher responded with, "Is that what our taxpayer money is for?" Just absolutely astounding. Not just a lack of understanding of out-of-home care, but a lack of sensitivity for what children and young people need. The low expectations of students is particularly telling. Children and young people told us about when people just don't expect anything of them, and it demotivates children and young people to want to do better. And as we heard from the start from Liana, the kids that we spoke to so want to engage in education. School is a place where they get to see friends and peers, and they get to partake in activities that enrich them, that develop them. But when you've got people constantly not expecting very much of you, just like those NAPLAN participation rates, you start to see children and young people disengage and think, well, why am I here if no one is expecting anything of me, if no one expects me to be and become more than what I am right now? Relationships between carers and schools. A really clear example of how this plays out is around modified timetables, or when behaviours of children weren't able to be managed, and so carers would be called up to come and pick up the child or the young person, take them home from school. It impacts on how a carer cares. And for so many carers that are trying to juggle work and a whole range of things, as Missy said, her aunt was doing a phenomenal job of getting all the kids to school, all the things that carers need to balance, and then just not having an understanding about how actions a school can take can impact so directly on a carer's day-to-day responsibilities. I want to focus a little bit now on the experiences at school for Aboriginal children and young people in care, and they experience very much the same, these other features of and challenges, but with an added layer of racism onto it. It's this quote, it gets me so upset, and I remember the child who said it. I don't like it. I don't like when I get bullied, when boys call me names and stuff. He tells me not to touch him with my poo skin, says black people are gay. People don't want to be friends with me. That layer of exclusion just for your identity. And when I talk about this, this inquiry, that exclusion just because of who you are, whether it's because of your cultural identity, the color of your skin, how else you might identify, what community you see yourself as connected to. It's such an exclusionary experience. And again, it's that added layer of complexity and the feeling that I don't want to be in this space if I'm not going to be looked after in this space. And that's what children and young people so desperately need if they're going to learn and do as best as they possibly can. So what we heard, not just from Aboriginal children and young people, but from carers, from people like career engagement support officers, a whole range of people, was that racism persists in the education system from early childhood settings and onwards, and that there are many, many, far too many Aboriginal children who do not feel supported to speak up when they speak about racism, who are told all manner of things so that it doesn't actually get dealt with. The lack of cultural safety in education settings is an ongoing issue, despite there being efforts, particularly in public schools, around training that simply isn't enough to address what's actually happening. And for Aboriginal kids who are in out-of-home care, they may well be disconnected from not only their family, but from also their culture and their country. So they don't have those protective factors in their lives that help them understand and help them address and cope with racism. Not that they should have to, but they have someone at home or a culture backing them up that says what they're saying is wrong. You are strong, you are proud, you are all of the good things. What that child or teacher potentially is saying is simply not true. We heard from children and young people talking about racist slurs being used towards them, not just by peers, but by teachers. We heard about children just removing themselves from a learning space because they knew the teacher taking that class was racist. And all of these things contribute to a child or a young person removing themselves from those educational opportunities that should be in place for every child. Before I move on to the partnering and early childhood agreements, Keita and Missy, was there anything else you wanted to add in about those barriers and those challenges with engagement?
Yes, I did just want to say the quote before from the school student about is that what our taxpayers' money pays for? That's disgusting. I've heard some questionable things, especially from like younger people who don't really have that perspective and don't understand quite as much as older people, and especially a teacher. And also like I think it's hard when you go from like obviously like the world is the world, not everybody knows everything, every person is different. But to throw a comment like that at a student who's already like school is supposed to be like a safe place. Like for a lot of people, that's the only sense of security they have when they're in care. And then when you hear comments like that, it just makes you feel like what is life? Like what am I doing? What's happening? It's so out of control. And as well, the comment from the little girl about like what people say about her skin color and things like that. I wouldn't say that I understand, but also like if you're in a school system and you're in care, but your peers aren't being educated around you about that sort of stuff and it's getting thrown at you when you're 7 years old, then it's like what is life as you grow up? Like where's that support and where's that engagement for like education? Like how are people going to learn, and how's that little girl going to grow up with a sense of stability and like a sense of belonging if that's what's being thrown at her forever? You know what I mean? Yeah, it's quite disgusting.
Yeah, I can't agree more, Missy, with everything you've said. And I think there's, that lack of understanding of these systems and what actually happens to kids in care, but also just a lack of kindness and decency. And we need to see that modelled from the adults around children and young people to, say, well, this kind of talk and behaviour isn't on. It's, we're an inclusive space. We look after each other.
Yeah.
that particular young child had some very good supports around her. You know, but yeah. Kita, sorry.
I just wanted to say that when I entered care, I was in primary school, so I was about eight or nine, and I don't know if it's just the fact that I don't remember or it actually didn't happen, but I think I experienced like the most, or like my first instances of racism while in primary school when I entered care. And like when I look back on it now and I kind of reflect, I think like the hardest part about experiencing racism, especially when you're a child in care, is if you are disconnected from your culture. And personally for me, so I'm Southeast Asian, and I was with a white foster family, and I kind of like later on realized in my life when I like reflect on this stuff is like it's not so much like the reason I didn't speak up was because I didn't want to or I was afraid, but it was something that I didn't think would be understood by my foster parents, because how am I meant to like go home and ask them what to do when I'm confronted with racism when they have never experienced that in their entire life. And it also kind of it does take away your sense of belonging. It just kind of like relinquishes your right to feel as if you belong and as if you're who you think you are as well. Because I kind of pushed like my heritage away because I wanted to be normal. And it was quite obvious when a white lady came and picked me up from school, and I would have to be like, she's my auntie. Yeah, not really believable. But yeah, I just kind of like became kind of resentful around the fact that I wasn't a Caucasian person, because it made me different and it made me feel like I was like less than other people, which is, you know, obviously not correct. But I feel like there was never kind of the consideration around who I was as a person in terms of like my heritage and my family. And, you know, those are your developmental years and you kind of need to solidify your identity then. And then that's how sometimes when you are getting older or you transition out of care, you just are really out of touch with who you are.
Thank you, Kita. And I think the things that we say in this report and we say often around Aboriginal children and young people and their experiences, particularly around racism and connection to culture, are so applicable for children, you know, from so many different communities of colour that don't necessarily have that connection with their family and connection with culture. And, you know, they're protective factors. They're the things that keep you strong. And, you know, if placements are severing that, you know, that's just one aspect of yourself that's harder to navigate and find out about later in life. Yeah, thank you. So the partnering and early childhood agreements, I'm just going to the next slide. So these relate to two sets of agreements. Firstly, the out-of-home care education commitment, which we refer to as the partnering agreement, and then the early childhood agreement for children in out-of-home care, and that's the early childhood agreement. And the idea behind these partnerships, these agreements, is to govern collaborative efforts to improve education, health and wellbeing for kids in out-of-home care. And they have, both sets of agreements have very similar coverage, but early childhood agreement goes a little bit further and it covers children and young people in voluntary care placements. And it also, where possible, looks at vulnerable children, including Aboriginal children and children who are known to child protection but might not necessarily be in out-of-home care. Oops, I'm pressing the wrong buttons and I'm totally forgot how to drive. There we go. What we found was that the partnering agreements worked in different ways, and that we saw that whilst there were things in the partnering agreements to promote enrolments and attendance and achievement, to work on things like attendance and school retention and completion, We sometimes saw things didn't play out in consistent ways. And I think that was a feature across lots of things that we saw, that whilst we saw some very good examples of practice in lots of ways, we didn't see that consistently across the board. And often we saw, as the result of a really fantastic principal or leadership group at a particular school, we saw some great outcomes for children and young people in out-of-home care, but just didn't see that consistency across the board. And that's what we would hope. A child, no matter where they are in Victoria, if they're in out-of-home care, they're getting access to the same opportunities and the same understanding. So there are things that the partnering agreements require. I'm going to focus on the partnering agreement. So that's the one between, that's the one for the school, so primary school and high school. Things like requiring schools to have a learning mentor for every child or young person in out-of-home care. 18% of students did not have one, so nearly 1 in 5. SSGs, student support groups, 10% of children did not have one. And I remember hearing a young person out of care saying, what are they now? Like, what's this? Which is very indicative of, okay, so they're not being consistently used and understood. And often we saw with those SSG meetings, they were rolled out and played out in very different ways, with, again, inconsistency of approaches. Sometimes education was the back burner of a discussion. Individual education plans, 11% didn't have them. And also, children and young people are required to have an educational needs assessment undertaken after 3 months in care. 30% of eligible students had an education needs assessment. So not nearly enough children getting those assessments done, which were really important to understand where a child or young person was at in their education and what supports they needed. And those supports were really important to making sure that a young person or child were able to engage in their education. A key aspect of these partnering agreements was the work of the lookout centres, which are part of Department of Education, and they play a vital role in terms of I'm just driving these slides like something crazy, not right. They played a significant role in providing professional development for teachers, engaging, being a conduit between departments, but we made some recommendations about them as well. So re-engagement initiatives, and I'm really conscious of time, so I'm racing a little bit. Again, connection and relationships are so vitally important to make sure not only that children and young people stay engaged, but they, if they become disconnected, they can re-engage and be supported. And we saw some fantastic examples from places like flexible learning option schools that were very relationship-based, that met the child or young person where they were in terms of their experiences, their trauma, their needs. The Navigator program has had some limited success with children and young people, but we found that the Navigator program kicked in a bit too late, obviously, often when children had been chronically absent for a significant amount of time. And so we're trying to catch up and trying to undo a lot of disconnection, and not able to get those outcomes that they wanted to see. And of course, we heard some great stories about the one-on-one education supports. That was so helpful for children and young people. Having that additional person sit with you in a classroom that could provide supports, and maybe not just to that particular child in out-of-home care, but other kids as well. So there's a normality about getting extra assistance or getting that extra support that you need. So I want to fly a little bit through the recommendations. So obviously this inquiry, we're both looking at the out-of-home care system and we're looking at the education system. So we had clear recommendations for both. And when it came to the child protection and out-of-home care system, some of these overlap with previous recommendations that we've made in our previous inquiries. But I think a really key thing, as Liana was talking about earlier, is we need to review the child protection operating model to look at how do we address barriers to child protection practitioner retention? How do we make sure the practitioners that are in the system are being seen for their work and they're being retained in such a way that they can continue on, that we're not having such high attrition rates, turnover rates, which just creates such instability for children and young people, but also for their carers, and just, you know, requiring people to restart, redevelop relationships. We need to see child protection's focus on education increased and ensure that child protection visits to education settings occur only in exceptional circumstances. That's based on information we heard around child protection workers, workers from organisations providing out-of-home care, just rocking up to school at all hours to speak to a child or young person, which was an incredibly disruptive and kind of puts a laser light on a child or young person. Oh, why is this person coming to visit you at the school? What's going on there? So really thinking about it from the child's experience and perspective of what does it mean to have this person come to their school. Obviously, we need to support residential care providers so that they can make sure that educational engagement is happening, and that needs, we made many recommendations across about training and induction. Carer payments is something we've been on about for a long time, and other, as you see that lastly there, providing students in care with the free Victorian student travel pass. So for early education in schools, we advocate for nationally across the board for trauma-informed practice to be included in teacher training from the very beginning of becoming a teacher. Again, this is not just important for children in out-of-home care, but for so many more children. And the child maltreatment study that showed how many of us have experienced some sort of maltreatment, one of 5 types of maltreatment. You know, it's astounding, nearly 2/3. So it's not something that just a few people have to deal with. It's sadly much more prevalent than we thought to begin with. That consistency of approach, we really need to see a push on how schools are consistently engaging with children and young people who are in out-of-home care. And again, going back to training and what teachers and other school staff need to understand when it comes to children in out-of-home care. We want to see those expectations on children and young people about what they can achieve. So raising expectations, having that funded so that we can see students in care go on to further study like Missy and Keita are doing. We need to see tackling racism in schools, not just for Aboriginal kids in care, but for any child that experiences racism. And I'd say that goes for any kid that experiences any sort of discrimination based on identity. A big thing, it was our first recommendation, but for some reason we've got it there last. We want to get much more data around just what's happening in schools. Liana mentioned earlier around there's a 1 day a year census kind of attendance record taken, which really doesn't tell us anything about attendance and then engagement and then participation. And then we've got some things around the partnering and early childhood agreements. So looking for that consistency of approach and implementation, but particularly looking for additional resources in lookout centres. They do such an amazing job of connecting all the pieces of the puzzle, and they need to be supported much more. I'll leave that slide up just for a little bit longer, and I'm going to, Missy, am I going to hand to you next?
I believe so. I did just want to talk about I'm not sure which ones are the recommendations that you've brought up, but the trauma enforced teacher training one we came up with, and this one sort of correlates, you know, when we were talking about the data for education plans before. I remember we were sitting I was sitting with you and Liana and Yuki in an office one time, and we were talking about recommendations, and then it was about the trauma informed teaching, like training, and Liana asked me, she said, oh, have you had any of these assessments or these plans? And I was like, what are they? And she throws her hands up and she was like, what the heck? And I was like, but yeah, I think that the trauma enforced, like the teacher training, is quite a big one. And it links in with before, Meena, when you said about like pursuing like post-school education, like tertiary education and stuff, because when, like for me in my situation, obviously there's a lot going on behind the scenes, and like as a young person I don't know how to handle it all. I don't know what to do, and I like act out at school and I do all these things that I look back on and I'm like, why did I do that? But you have teachers who don't understand, and then those same teachers as well are like, you're not going to go very far, like you may as well just drop out, you know, do something else. This isn't beneficial for for anyone at all. And then it leaves you like sort of with this sense of like no belonging, and what am I meant to do? And like these people don't understand, like I felt crazy. Genuinely, I felt so crazy. I was like, is there something wrong with me? And like I look back on it now and I'm like at university and like sitting in my own room with like the things that I bought myself and the things that I do myself. And I'm like, maybe I wasn't crazy. Like maybe those people just didn't understand, and maybe that is something that people just need to be educated on, because as well for a long time, like I blamed myself. Like I thought the fact that I was in care was my own fault and something that like maybe I wasn't good enough. But if I could choose to speak to my younger self, like I would never tell like little me that you're not enough, or you're not going to make it, you're not going to go far. Like never in a million years. Or I look at my little sisters and I'm like, I don't think they're capable of doing nothing with their life. Like they're extraordinary, you know? But I think that's why recommendations like the trauma enforced training are like so little but so big. Like it's such a small thing. It could be like a day thing, but it can make such an impact on one person's life for so long. Like if I had have had a little bit more support and a little bit more encouragement that wasn't, you need to drop out and you're doing a bad job and what are you doing? You're crazy. Then maybe I wouldn't have struggled with that for so long. But yeah.
Yeah.
Peter, did you want to, you don't have to, but are there any of the recommendations that you feel really passionate about? Are there any that stick out as the most important ones to you?
I would just really agree with Missy, because I feel like a lot of the issues that I faced at school were exacerbated by the fact that the staff within my teaching environments didn't really understand the kind of effects that being in care had on me, and also how the systems kind of work. So I remember like being in high school, and I did have a really good relationship with my vice principal at the time. But at the same time, you know, he didn't really know everything and he didn't understand everything, but he did try. And yeah, maybe it would have been a lot easier to work through those things with them at school if they kind of knew what it can kind of manifest through behavior, I guess. And also just like, yeah, having the same standards for every young person in education, and not to think that somebody is less just because we were placed into situations that we couldn't control. Because I remember trying to enroll in year 11, and I was an independent minor at the time, so I didn't really have anybody with me, and it was just me walking into a school being like, hey, can I come here? And they made me talk to the wellbeing lady, and she dead on looked me in the eyes and went, are you actually going to show up though? Like, why don't you just go to TAFE? Because I want to graduate year 12 just like every other young person, because that is what is classified as normal. So like, let me be normal. And if you ask that, or if you like voice your low expectations, then you're going to take that on yourself and then trying to like, well, they didn't say that for nothing. Like, they probably think that I won't show up, and like, I haven't showed up in the past, so like, will I show up? But it's just like not a good feeling.
Thanks, Peter. Now I think our kind of formal presentation is just about done. Missy, did you want to read your piece now?
Yes, I will. I will just have to get it up on another tab. I need to figure out how to do that. Okay, I got it.
Can I Can I just say, all of our recommendations were worked out with the input of our youth council. So Missy and Keita and others had direct input into what our recommendations would look like, and the whole development of the whole inquiry was very much driven by the likes of Missy and Keita. And I think it's just we're so lucky. We're really lucky to continually learn from them and understand how we can do things differently.
Do I read this piece or? This piece is a piece that I wrote. I've read it a couple of times at a few different, I don't know what you would call it, meetings, I guess. But I think it's available on the Commission's website as well. We've started a Youth Voices page. If anyone wants to take a look at that. Yeah. At the end of year 12, a social worker I met while living in care let me know about an inquiry looking at the education of children and young people like me. The Let Us Learn inquiry, run by the Commission for Children and Young People, was gathering insights to see how education could be improved for children and young people living in state care, as I had already done for many years. A phone conversation about the inquiry soon followed, leading me to become a member of the Commission's Youth Council. Through the council, I was given massive opportunities to speak with other young people, staff, and commissioners, drawing on my experiences to help shape recommendations and call for change to what I considered a broken system. A favourite recommendation of mine, formulated in our group, was to advocate for trauma-informed teaching practices to be incorporated into teacher training. This recommendation really hit close to home when it came to the lack of understanding around trauma in education settings for children and young people in state care. I was often the troubled kid, the she's too much kid. I engaged in disruptive and destructive behaviour patterns frequently, and it wasn't until I got to year 11 and started to learn about the impacts of trauma on the brain that I finally understood that part of myself. Not only did I find closure on these parts of myself that were so unclear for so long, but I also developed an understanding of perhaps why my teachers responded the way they did to my behaviour. With the common solution being exclusion or suspensions, it's expecting a child to go back home for a few days to give yourself a break when not all kids necessarily have a home to go back to. Reflecting now from a completely different position in life, I find it much easier to see the perspectives and have compassion for the reactions of teachers that were a part of my life then. It's not normal as such to witness a child exhibit such behaviour, let alone be fully prepared on how to react. Likewise, it becomes an emotionally draining process on all parties. You've got a young person feeling a higher sense of rejection than they already do, and teachers feeling hopeless in their approach. This doesn't happen because teachers don't care or because young people in care are too much. It happens because the opportunities to learn about the impacts of trauma and help these kids learn life instead of learning how to run don't yet exist. Another recommendation that I, as a part of the Youth Council, helped to shape was ensure equitable financial support for kinship and foster carers. Money is often a barrier when it comes to caring adequately for a child, especially one that isn't your own. Young people in care, especially in my experience, often hold a lot of emotional baggage, trauma, and other prolonged physical or mental health issues that impact massively on their education. Many of these issues need to be addressed professionally, however, they cost money that too many carers struggle to pull from their pockets. Most carers struggle financially as is, and in a world like today where money is scarce, it makes it very difficult to support the growth, development, and healing of a child, which only takes a negative toll on their education. A family that is restricted and financially left without adequate support and resources will not be able to climb the same ladder as those around them, and this is especially the case for children in state care. But I believe with these recommendations, and with many others I worked on for the Let Us Learn inquiry, that change is possible. That is all.
Brilliant.
Thanks.
What a way to finish. Thank you so much, Liana, Meena, Keita, and Missy. That was a really brilliant and heartfelt presentation that was really easy to listen to and learn from. And I hope everyone here took value from that. I'm sure they did. And Missy, what a brilliant poem. Thank you for sharing. I really appreciate it. Wow. Okay. So I have lots of questions in the chat, and I've also taken a few from the registration process. So I'll potentially start off with those, and then hopefully we'll get time to address some of the ones that are coming in the chat thick and fast. I think the most popular question was about next steps. So this is to all panelists. There was a lot of interest in the process about where to from here. So how does the panel envision the inquiry and the Let Us Learn report driving reform to improve educational experiences and outcomes for children and young people in care and leaving care? Very broad, I know.
Meena and I are looking at each other to work out who's going to go first. Okay, it's me. I mean, the short answer, and I'll give a short answer, is we've made the recommendations to government. There are recommendations that are directed to both the Department of Education, the Department of Families, Fairness and Housing. The response is due at the end of May. I am hopeful that that timeframe means, given that that will be after the state budget, that there will be some detail in there about some of the recommendations that might need some additional investment to support. So we will see really when we get the government response. I mean, we are doing a lot of, as Missy said, a lot of meetings, a lot of presentations, a lot of talking. Missy and Meena and I and another young woman who contributed, Jazz, spoke to the parliamentary inquiry into state education last week or the week before. We're really trying to make this a piece of work that is alive and that others join with us in advocating about, because yes, we'll hope to see some immediate wins and immediate progress, but some of what we're talking about across systems as broad as early childhood education and our school systems, these are going to take long-term sustained efforts. So we're both hopeful that we'll see some immediate action, but really what we hope, I think, from this is that the piece of work that we've put together will actually kind of change hearts and minds and persuade people to think about school and early childhood education differently for children in care, but actually potentially to look at education a bit differently for a whole range of children much more broadly.
Thank you. Brilliant answer. I am going to move through these quite quickly, so I'm sorry, but I want to get to them all. This is for Keita and Missy. Can you share what your vision for children and young people in care within education looks like? So an example, what would your ideal school or education setting look and feel like?
Can I say something?
Yeah.
This is a really big question to answer because obviously it's different for everyone. But me personally at school, like probably before year 12 actually, probably if I was going to say like an ideal time at school would be if people had, and I've already said this a million times in other situations, but if people had more compassion, because it like such a little bit goes a long way. Like, you know, the Macca's slogan when it's like a little goes a long way at Macca's? It's like that. It's so much like that because I'm not going to get into it because I could talk about it for 10 years, but probably just more compassion and more, if people were open to opening their eyes a bit more, that's probably a big one. Yeah.
Thanks, Missy.
I would say just a place where you feel safe to walk into. You don't have to have the preschool like anxiety that you get, except for like maybe school photos. And also just to maybe make schoolwork and assessments more accessible for all individuals who might not want to do an oral presentation in front of the entire classroom, or maybe just like don't really feel like writing a 1,000-word essay. And there are definitely other alternatives to doing assignments like that, and I just don't really think that they're offered enough.
Couldn't agree more. Okay, thank you. This question is for all panelists again. So the report highlighted that when Aboriginal culture is acknowledged, taught and celebrated in schools, Aboriginal children and young people are more likely to feel seen, safe and comfortable to engage in learning. What are some of the approaches to making schools culturally safe suggested by Aboriginal children and young people and other stakeholders that you spoke to that would benefit all children?
You know, we always, when we talk about cultural safety, we talk about it at its very heart being about respect and about inclusion and about seeing people for who they are. There's no questioning, no challenging of their identity. And there's so much around our understanding of cultural safety that is transferable to everyone, about making just any child or young person feel included. When it comes to cultural safety, it's about making Aboriginal children and young people feel safe because of their cultural identity. And there's so many different practices that we can do that supports that. And I think what happens when it's done well is that Aboriginal children and their families are listened to by the schools. They're actively engaged. There's a building of trust between the families, but also what we saw was when a CESO role, the Career Education Support Officer, when that role was really well respected and their role clarity was clear, that was when you had the best outcomes. I heard not just through this inquiry, but from other forums and spaces that I'm in about a lack of understanding of what the CESO role is and what they can do. Is it direct family, child support, engagement and support, or is it professional support for the teaching staff? Is it, for one school? Is it for a region? There's so many different aspects of understanding that, but at the heart of it is treating those roles with respect and treating Aboriginal culture and identity with respect. And so when you have those supportive relationships and conversations, that's when things can move forward. But it's also understanding that a lot is being asked of Aboriginal community and Aboriginal families where they might not necessarily have all the cultural knowledge because of colonisation. So I always remember one example of a school wanting to implement Aboriginal language into their curriculum, which is fantastic. But for the particular community they were engaging with, they were still learning their language after it having been, elders not being allowed to speak it and it being actively prevented from being passed. So there's often lots of things that, whilst a good initiatives, we need to think about how does it actually impact on the community that's providing those supports. But it really just all starts with positive relationships and honestly building that relationship before a need arises, before, not going in and being like, oh, we need you to do this, and there's no pre-existing relationship or trust before that.
Brilliant. Thank you, Meena. This one is on aspiration, and you did touch on this a lot in the presentation, which personally, working on the Raising Expectations program, big fan of. So I will get to the question. Our program has been addressing low expectations in regards to TAFE and university study for young people in out-of-home care. Can you reflect on what you heard in the inquiry about how important it is to hold aspiration for children and young people's education and what the impact of this is? Particularly keen for Missy and Keita to answer this one.
I feel like if I was Macca's and I had to have a slogan, what I say probably so much is, well, like when I talk to practitioners, teachers, stakeholders, literally anybody within the sector or any aspect of working in advocacy, I always say that the best thing that you can do is hold hope and believe in young people, because for me personally, like I know that there were definitely times where I felt pretty hopeless and I felt like I wasn't capable of things and I held like low expectations for myself, but then had at least one other person, particularly adults around me, who told me that they did believe in me and they actively like encouraged me to pursue certain things like education and to like stick with it. And even if I was going through like a rough patch, like I had a few inpatient admissions, which obviously impact your attendance. It's like also reassurance that just because you are kind of going through an obstacle doesn't mean that you can't finish the race, basically. So I just think that when you have somebody who like believes in you, or you have kind of like somebody else telling you that you are capable when you are like dead set convinced that you can't do it, it basically like helps you do it, because yeah.
Thank you, Keita. Missy, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I would just agree with Keita. Like sometimes when you're at school and you hear kids say, "Oh, my dad puts too much pressure on me. I wish I had a dad to put pressure on me." You know what I mean? Like, I don't know. It's just really hard when people are constantly at you and they're like, "Oh, but you don't have to worry about it because you're not going to make it there anyway." And it's like when you finally get there, like I'm at university now and I'm like, yeah, I got there, but I didn't do that because other people helped me. I did it myself. But it's really hard because the whole thing was just like a battle of like, am I worthy enough to do it? Like, am I capable enough to do it? And I just think with like raising expectations, like those sort of programs are so like valid and so necessary, because you have kids like my brother, for example, was pushed down a lot and like went to prison and is on like a really bad path because he was just constantly told like, you're not going to make it, you're not going to get anywhere. So that's what he did. You know what I mean? So like, again, a little goes a long way at Macca's. Like, you just need those sort of people. Yeah.
Thanks, Missy. I love how this has become a theme within the discussion about Macca's. All right, moving on. I have a lovely question here from a residential care worker who says, specifically for Keita and Missy, I'm sorry, Liana and Meena, a lot of these questions are for Keita and Missy. How do we make young people in residential care, and I would extend that to all care, to feel safe and supported enough to engage in education? Big question again to finish us off.
That's a big question.
I know, I'm sorry.
I feel like I personally wasn't in resi care. I was in kinship and also foster care. But things that helped me were like stability. And I know it's really hard when you're in care because like you pack your bags in a garbage bag and you change every, like 6 weeks or whatever. Like it's different for everybody, but stability and also just like reassurance that like you're capable of doing it, and to know that if you're having a tough time that you can fall back on someone to help you if you're having a hard time, whether that's at school or like with your homework or with peers or whatever. And again, like it can just take one person just for like reassurance that there's going to be someone there. But I do know that that's really hard for people such as workers because they have like a whole nother life. Like it's not as simple as I'll be there all the time. Like it's a really difficult situation. But yeah.
Thank you, Missy.
Yeah, it was a really big question. And the only thing that kind of came to mind was when I was in care, I was with Anglicare at the time, and the office, because I was in regional Melbourne, I was in Melton. So we had the one office for all the kids in the area. And they ran a homework club once a fortnight. So whether you're in high school, whether you're in primary school, I think like teaching staff volunteered, and also some of the workers at the office volunteered as well. And you'd go there on a day after school and you'd bring all your homework, and then people would sit down with you and help you do it. So that was really fun. And personally, I wasn't in resi either. I was also in foster and kinship. But I feel like sometimes doing things that you don't want to do, such as homework, is easier when you kind of body double. And for people that don't know what body doubling is, it's like when somebody just kind of sits with you while you do something to kind of basically hold you accountable, I guess. And also the other thing that I kind of thought of was when I entered care, I had been disengaged from school for a really long time. So sometimes you're not at the same level as your peers, but you'll still get the same work. And I feel like if you're a resi worker and you want to help your young person kind of like engage in school, you just really need to be patient, I guess, and understanding and then compassion. So, yeah.
Well said. All right, everyone, it's 12:30, so I've done no justice to all of the questions, but hopefully we can send out an email afterwards to thank everyone and give some more information for those that didn't get their questions answered. I do just want to give you a big thank you. Really appreciate your time and the energy that you put in today. It was brilliant to hear from you all, and I hope that the audience got a lot out of it. I'm sure they did. We do have some information on the screen. If you'd like to reach out to continue the conversation, please do check out the report on the Commission's website as well, and we will make sure to include that in our email out. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.